Good afternoon and welcome everybody to the April meeting of the Divorce Support Club. And today we're going to talk about what not to do in divorce and what to do instead. And I'm joined today by Emily Green, who is a lawyer at Walker Family Law. And Emily, would you like to just quickly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you? Thank
Yes,
you.
hi. So I'm Emily. Been working at Walker Family Law for just over a year now. I qualified in 2005, and I work in the family finance department, specialising in financial remedy proceedings, and I also do some children private law work as well.
Brilliant. So really wide experience. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, Emily. Thank you. I'm going to start sharing my screen because I'll introduce myself with that as well. Okay, so um, my name's Claire Macklin. I'm a breakup and divorce coach, and that's all I do. So I specialise in that area of coaching. I'm a master NLP practitioner and a former lawyer, an insolvency lawyer though, rather than a family lawyer. I've been divorced twice myself. I'm also the single mum of two teenage boys, one soon to be 20, so I won't be able to say that anymore. I'm also the author of a book that you can see behind me, Breakup from Crisis to Confidence. And together with Walker Family Law, we've created the Divorce Support Club to give a kind of a different platform, a different service for Walker Family Law clients and others, to give a kind of a more emotional and coaching perspective so that you can start to concentrate on you rather than on your ex, so that we can share strategies with you to help you become calm and get clarity, so that you can focus on what you can control rather than what you can't. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. To help you see options and choices and gather information, to help you communicate more effectively, and ultimately to help you create a new future that you're excited about and that you love. So today, as I said, we're going to talk about what not to do in divorce. And rather than keeping it all negative, I really want to make sure that we give you some tips and strategies for what to do instead. So the first one I would say is don't try to do it all alone. Don't try to go through your divorce by yourself without any help, because it can be really overwhelming. My two divorces are very different. The first one was really not my choice at all. It was kind of thrust upon me. And the second one, I made the choice. Both ways were challenging in their own ways. And trying to do it all on my own would have been really overwhelming. Divorce is not a life event that any of us chose or planned for when we get married. It's something that is challenging, it's stressful, it can be quite lonely, and it can be a bit frightening. You might perhaps feel all sorts of emotions, perhaps lost, abandoned, betrayed, uncertain, and reaching out for help is one of the strongest things that you can do as you go through the process. So rather than trying to do it all alone, create a really strong support network around you. And there are various aspects to this, I believe. The first one perhaps is emotional. So really start to notice who your radiators friends are and who the drains on you are. So choosing your support team really wisely is really important. So when you're next with friends or relatives, when you come home, think about how you feel when you spend time with those people. Do you feel uplifted? Do you feel comforted? Do you feel calm? Do you feel refreshed, loved, supported? Or do you feel pressed, angry, frustrated, perhaps unheard, criticised, unsupported, or judged? Does that person perhaps tell you what to do? Do they ask you what you need? And then have a think about whether you want to spend more time or less time with that person or those people. And choose to spend time with those people who are your radiators, those who support you, those who lift you, those who help you to feel better. You might also perhaps need practical help. So you might need help with childcare, or you might need help with DIY or shopping or I remember once needing to lug an old carpet out of a bedroom. There's no way I could have done it on my own, take apart the beds and everything. You might need help with perhaps preparing your financial documents, getting them into order. Or you might want somebody to sit with you when you open the first email that you receive from your divorce lawyer. Or maybe you need a friend who you can forward emails from your ex to so that they can help you to think about exactly what bits you need to reply to. Or maybe you would like somebody to come along to meetings so that they can write notes so that you can concentrate on listening. Have a think about what practical support you need. And then, of course, there's professional support. So I always think of divorce as being an emotional journey with legal and financial consequences. So if you can, get these three kinds of professional support. First of all, legal. So choose your solicitor really carefully. And Emily probably has got some really good advice on this. Choose a solicitor that you feel you have rapport with, that you like, and who has the right experience for your situation. And before you perhaps go into your first meeting with that solicitor, think about what your priorities are and what skills you'd like that solicitor to have. So, for example, if you're in a joint business, you'll be looking for a solicitor who has experience in that area. Or if your ex-partner is extremely difficult, maybe you want to be looking for a solicitor who has a reputation for being strong but calm. Not a Rottweiler, strong but calm. And then there's emotional professional support. Lots of people make the mistake, I believe, of thinking of divorce as being simply a legal process, but it's not. It's really a very emotional time, and it's commonly accepted now as the second most traumatic life event you can go through. It can shake your whole life up. I always think it's a bit like somebody taking your whole life on a blanket and throwing that blanket up into the air. Different bits of your life will land in different places. It's really discombobulating. So getting emotional support and guidance will be really important. It can help you overcome the feelings that you have so that you can start to move forward confidently. And it gives you a safe space to explore those feelings before they kind of take over your decision making. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And then financial. So the decisions that you make now will have a long-term effect on your future and that of your children if you have them. So make sure that you take financial advice at an early stage. If you involve a financial planner, they'll be able to show you, for example, cash flow forecasts for what any proposed settlement might look like. They might be able to advise you on mortgage capacity. And it can be easy to ignore this part and kind of bury your head in the sand because your financial future might feel quite frightening and it might feel very scary. And it's sometimes easy to kind of push it to one side and not look at it. Please don't. It's far better to know where there might be a gap or where there might be a problem so that you can think about what you can do to fill that gap. I always believe clarity is the antidote to overwhelm in this area. So take that advice as far as you can. The next thing that I would say is don't listen to well-intentioned but ill-informed advice because this can really blow things up, a bit like the volcano in this picture. You know, this is when you listen to advice from, I don't know, the person next to you at the pub, or the woman on the bus, or the friend whose divorce was very acrimonious, or your mum or your dad whose divorce was maybe 25 years ago. Um, these are often, this can lead you down a much more emotional path. It can fuel the fire of emotions. And it's when your emotions are really heightened that you make decisions perhaps led by anger or led by fear. So try not to make assumptions that your divorce will be exactly the same as your friends or somebody else that you meet. I've worked with hundreds of people now through divorce, and everybody reacts, thinks, and behaves very differently. So your case is unique. So what to do instead? Again, build your support network really carefully. Be really careful who you share your innermost thoughts and worries with, and take really specific advice on your situation. And I'd also say set your intentions around how you want to show up. Steer your own ship, steer your own course, know how you want to behave and who you want to be through this process, and get the information that you need to be able to make the best decisions for you. I'd also add, don't base your decisions on the kind of scary stories you might see in the press as well. Base your decisions on really good advice information from your lawyer, your financial advisor, and on actual information so that you really can be in charge of steering your own ship in the direction that you want to go. And then I'd also say don't make decisions from a place of fear or really high emotion, because fear and anxiety and really strong emotions mean that we shut down our logical decision making. It means we make decisions that perhaps aren't rational and they may not even be in our own best interests. So, for example, things like replying to every angry email that you might get from your ex-partner in equally angry words, because this will only keep you in a cycle of conflict, which will rack up time, it will rack up costs, it will rack up stress, it will make everything more acrimonious, and it will leave you both more damaged at the end of the process. Not taking advice on possible financial settlements for fear of your partner's reaction is something that I commonly see, or because perhaps your partner has told you that if you consult a lawyer, they'll make it difficult for you. That can be really tricky to handle. And what I always say to my clients when they're afraid of their partner's reaction is to say, look, this is a process. This is a process that's alien to us. And it's a process where there are professionals who can help to guide us, and there's a process to follow. And we need to do that. And just keep repeating that like a stuck record. The other thing is when you stick your head in the sand because of fear around what the future looks like. I always think it's better to know and deal with the reality rather than an imagined catastrophe. So, what to do instead? Things like stopping and breathing and thinking before you respond is really powerful. It gives you time to get your logical brain back on side. When you breathe, you get oxygen back into your brain and it soothes the emotional responses that you may be having. I also adhere to the 24-hour rule. When I was going through my first divorce, particularly, I never replied to an email from my ex-partner while I was feeling angry. I would maybe dash out a reply, but then I'd sleep on it. I'd come back to it in the morning, and oftentimes I would delete that message and start all over again. So leave things 24 hours, give your brain time to process before you respond. Take advice if you need to, get clarity to make informed choices. Choices are so important. I will say, if you believe you've only got one option, then you're stuck. Two options means you have a dilemma, which isn't much better. And three options means you have real choice and you can make conscious decisions to go one way or another. Even if two of those options are really not what you want to do and you take the third option, you will still feel like you are in control of making that choice, which will help to soothe and to calm. And I'd also say take a step back. So take an imaginary step back. Almost imagine that you are watching what's happening going on, like it's on the stage in front of you. And think about what would I advise those characters to do next? What would I advise myself to do in this situation? What would my best friend advise me to do in this situation? And what would my future self suggest that I do here? And you could also ask yourself, what would be the most empowered or confident or dignified decision that I could make right now? And then I'd also suggest that you start to notice perhaps when you are catastrophizing and going kind of to worst case scenario. It's really easy to do because our brains are geared towards noticing threats. But start to notice when you're catastrophizing and really challenge it. Because our brains are super clever. So they can create really powerful images of all the terrible things that might happen and what could go wrong. And that's part of our subconscious trying to keep us safe. It's trying to warn us of the perceived threats there might be. But that puts us into fight, flight, freeze. And then it becomes very difficult to respond. We release cortisol, release adrenaline, and over time that can lead us to feel really anxious. So instead, turn it around and ask yourself, what if that doesn't happen? What if I am okay? What if I am safe? And remind yourself that you are safe in this present moment right now. And that will help to soothe that sort of catastrophizing that is really, really easy to fall into. Next, don't involve your children in your conflict. I'm not going to talk about this in any huge depth because there are other webinars that we've done to cover some of this, and we've got some coming up as well in the next couple of months. But the thing that I found most helpful in my situation was to remind myself that our children were our children. They were 50% of us. They aren't mine and they aren't his. They're their own person. Um, and I also used to remind myself that I once loved this person enough to have children with them. And it was in the children's best interests for us to keep them out of that conflict so that they could have a really good relationship with us both. Of course, I'm not talking about situations here where there might be abuse or there might be safeguarding issues. Those are something different and to take specific advice on. But research generally shows that children thrive when they're really seen, when they're heard, when they're able to have positive relationships with both of their parents. The next thing I'd say to avoid is using unhealthy avoidance strategies. This will differ from person to person. It might be drinking too much, it might be drug taking, it might be partying really hard, it might be throwing yourself into work 24/7, it might be excessively exercising, it could be stalking your ex perhaps on social media. Anything that you're doing to avoid the feelings that you might have. So instead, look after your mind and body and take time out to eat really well. Eat regular meals, even if they're small. I remember when I was first going through my first divorce, I could barely eat. So I used to eat bananas a lot and handfuls of nuts a lot, and just little and often. And because your body needs fuel, it needs fuel to cope with everything that's happening, and to deal with the stress that you may well feel you're under. Do some gentle exercise, take yourself off out for a walk. Your body really needs to have those things to keep it going. And eating well and taking that little bit of exercise will help you to cope better, even though you may not feel like doing it at the time. Exercise will also release endorphins, which boost your mood and will encourage your body to produce more of the feel-good hormones like serotonin and dopamine to kind of counteract the cortisol, and the adrenaline that the stress perhaps is releasing. And then sleep. And I know that lots of my clients really struggle to sleep, and I remember this myself as well. So if you're somebody who's struggling to sleep, then try to make sure that you have a really good routine in the evening, that you go to bed perhaps at a similar time every night. You turn your phone off, or at least turn your notifications off on your emails at least an hour before bed. I would suggest that you don't look at your emails at all in the evening, if you can. Avoid caffeine as well in the evening, and maybe keep a journal by the side of your bed so that if you wake up in the middle of the night, you can get those thoughts out of your head. I know that thoughts can often swirl around. Getting them out of your head and onto the page using your pen and your hand rather than a computer, really helps to perhaps get those thoughts out of your head and onto the page. And there are also lots of relaxation strategies and techniques that you could try out to help calm your nervous system. And I'd also say it's really important to acknowledge your feelings. Rather than trying to squish them down, name them. Perhaps rank how strongly they feel right now, because naming them will help to reduce their hold over you. And you could also imagine them perhaps like a wave. These feelings wash over you, they come, they go. They never stay forever. They're always transitory. They rise and they fall. So start to notice how they're rising and falling for you. The next don't on my list is don't use your divorce to punish your ex-partner. This doesn't work. Emily, I'll ask Emily about this in a minute, but the court won't do this either on your behalf. And doing this will really keep you stuck in anger, which can be really destructive. You know, it's a normal part of the healing process to feel angry at times, but holding on to it can really keep you stuck. There's a couple of really lovely analogies that I like. The first one is that drinking anger is like, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. Or it's like picking up a hot coal to throw at someone else, but burning your own hand in the process. It will leave you frustrated. And I don't know, Emily, do you want to add something in here? Because I know we were talking about this the other day, weren't we, in preparation?
Yeah, I think it's really just being kind to yourself and being kind to others. If you approach divorce as being a foundation for your future, and you're laying those foundations at a really early stage, and if you come in hostile, angry, bitter, you're really setting yourself up for a very difficult path ahead. And coming in
Mm.
from a different angle and changing your viewpoint, coming in from a point of being kind to yourself, being kind to others, and using the process not to punish each other and point score is going to mean the process becomes a lot easier on both sides as the course progresses. So it's really just approaching things from an angle of kindness rather than as a conflicting situation. You both want the end goal, which is to get out of it as quickly and as painlessly as possible. So the end goal is always the same, but getting through that process is often difficult along the way.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And some of the language that the media, for example, use around divorce is really unhelpful in this context. They talk about battles and language like that is so unhelpful. So I think what you were saying is very similar to what I was saying about setting your intention.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, if you're feeling that anger, don't use the divorce process to process that anger. Use your emotional support. Use your therapist or your coach as a way to deal with that anger rather than bringing it into the process because it will make it really expensive and expensive not just financially but expensive emotionally and for your future as well. So that kind of leads on, don't let go of your own morals and ethics and your sense of self. So in 5 years' time, and I've done this twice, so I know this. In 5 years' time, this will just be a period of your life that you went through, and it's really worth stopping to have a think about how you want to feel then. So ask yourself questions like, how do I want to feel about how I behave now in 5 years' time? How do I want my children to view how we behave now in 5, 10, 15 years' time? What do I want my relationship with my ex to look like in 5, 10, 15 years' time? Especially if you have children together, you're going to have to see each other at graduations, weddings, those kinds of things. And also what you want your parenting relationship to look like, because your relationship with your ex as your ex-partner is different to your relationship with your ex as your co-parent. So it's worth thinking about those two things separately. So be really clear on who you want to be, the outcome you want to achieve, and really keep that in the fore of your mind all the time. And then you can ask yourself whether what you're about to say or what you're about to do is going to take you nearer or further away from that outcome that you want to get to. And then the next one is try not to control things that you just can't control. So I prefer to think of this as controlling the controllables. You can only control your own stuff. You can only control your own words and your own thoughts, your own feelings and behavior and reactions and decisions. You can't control other people's, and particularly you can't control your ex's. And sometimes the more you try to control or influence your ex's behavior and so on, the harder it becomes and the more frustrated you get because they just don't do what you want them to do. So really focus on staying in what I call this blue zone in the middle, the blue zone of power, rather than stepping into the yellow zone of frustration. Focus on what you can do rather than what you can't. Focus on thinking what changes and shifts you can make rather than hoping that the other person is going to be different. That's where your power lies. And then on smaller things, you can control things like your environment, perhaps. You can control how you show up. You can control what you say, what you do. And you can control how you respond effectively. And I often talk about discretionary engagement with my clients. And one of my clients came up with that phrase about 4 years ago. And I thought it was brilliant. You can choose when you respond, how you respond, and what you say when you do respond. And sometimes you can choose not to respond, and that's a response in itself. So really focus on what is within your control rather than falling down the trap of trying to control others. And my last one is don't let go of hope for the future. It can be really easy to feel that there isn't any hope for the future particularly when you're right at the start of a divorce, perhaps that you didn't want. It can really feel like it's the end of the world. And if there's one thing that you take away from here, I really want you to hear this. It really isn't the end of the world. I thought mine was the end of the world, and it really hasn't been. In fact, it's opened up all kinds of opportunities for me. Divorce is an ending of a marriage, but it can also be the start of something different. It can be the beginning of a whole new chapter of your life. So some small steps that you can take right from the beginning are things like trying new things, saying yes rather than no to opportunities. When you find something challenging, remind yourself you can learn. Perhaps you can't do something yet, but you can learn how to, and take it one step at a time. So that's stop that share. That's some of the things from a coaching perspective that I would advise people not to do. So I'm sure there are some things, Emily, from a legal perspective that you would like to bring to this as well. What are some of the legal don'ts that you've seen people do that you wish they didn't?
Yeah. So I think the first thing to say is come in and be very clear and open and honest with your legal advisor. Don't try and hide anything. Don't try and hide assets, for instance. When you're coming in for the first appointment, try and get yourself as organised as you possibly can. It's always really good to come in with a clear idea of what assets there are and what liabilities there are in a case. So rather than spending a lot of time at the outset trying to identify what they are, if you could come in with at least a summary or some knowledge base as to, for instance, what the house is possibly worth, how much is left on the mortgage, what each party has got in their bank accounts, whether each party has a pension, for instance, and what possible value that might have. Getting organised means that your solicitor is not searching for that information and having to continually request. So it just makes things start at a much easier point, and we can give the best advice that we can once we have the full information available to us. So getting yourself organised is going to mean that we're spending less time gathering that information. It's going to cost you less money, and you're going to receive better advice at the outset, rather than coming in and not having any clear idea as to what assets are in each individual case. I would say taking legal advice as early as possible, perhaps even before you do separate, just getting a clear idea as to what your rights are. Sometimes we have people that come in and they've tried to deal with as much as they possibly can themselves, and it's then very difficult to unpick what agreements they've come to, which perhaps aren't in their best interests at all, but they've gone down this line and course, which perhaps wasn't the right thing for them to do. So getting legal advice at a really early outset of the case, either before you've separated or just after, is a really good idea. Even if you then go away and take some time afterwards, you're sort of starting on the right course.
Yeah, one of the things that often comes up when I'm talking to people in the sort of early stages as well is taking some legal advice in terms of the process and what it looks like,
Yeah.
because it's such an alien process if you don't work in this arena. It's a really scary process. So, right at an early stage, or again, like you were saying, before you separate, going to get some advice on what the process actually looks like and how long
Yeah.
it takes and what's
Yeah.
involved
Yeah.
is really helpful to give you that clarity.
And those are the things that we cover mainly at the initial appointment. So we give you advice on what a divorce is going to look like, what the financial process is going to look like, and if you have children, what a children application could look like. So it's getting that really informative information as early as possible, so you can then make decisions coming from a good starting place.
Yeah. So some of the people listening might feel afraid, perhaps, or anxious about the kind of the costs of divorce. And I talked about the importance of, and well, we both talked about the importance of getting that advice. So do you have any suggestions for what people should or shouldn't do when they're communicating with you as their solicitor, so that they can keep those costs kind of under control?
Mm. So as solicitors, most people offer an initial consultation, which is really, really good value for money. At Walker Family Law, we do an initial consultation for £250 plus VAT. But you get a lot of information during that hour appointment. And after the appointment, after the advice is given, we also follow that up with a letter of advice that the clients can refer back to. If after that they decide to instruct a solicitor, then what I would say is to try and write down notes, and keep a log and a list of any really pertinent questions that you need answered either urgently, or if they could wait perhaps 7 days, keeping a journal, keeping that log. And rather than sending sort of 3, 4, 5 emails a day, just sending one long email maybe once a week, that's really going to help reduce the costs that are going to be incurred, rather than a solicitor having to spend the time looking at each individual email one at a time and responding to each individual point. We can answer that more effectively and more cost effectively, dealing with it with one email at a time. So if
Yeah.
people can, I know it's not always possible, but if they can sort of write the lists and store them up for even a few days at a time, it does definitely help to keep the costs under control.
I guess as well that helps you in terms of you don't have to keep going back in and reminding
That's right.
yourself of what's
Mm,
happened. And something that
mm,
I've seen sometimes happening with the clients that I work with as well is the initial email that they might send is one fueled by emotional fear.
absolutely.
And then by the time they've had a little bit of time to process that, they actually sometimes answer the question themselves, or they realize that they do understand what they need to do, or and they are, they don't
Mm.
need that
Yeah,
advice
or
anymore.
it may not even be a legal question. It may
Yeah,
just be a question that's cropped up that actually a family or a friend could actually answer. And by the time they've had the 24 hours, which is a brilliant golden rule, 24-hour
yeah,
response, they may have already come to the answer themselves or had the question answered elsewhere. So, you know, giving yourself that bit of time rather than making the knee-jerk reactions and, like you say, maybe typing an email, but just storing it for the 24 hours and then reflecting on what the content is. Do I actually need these questions answered now, or could I store them up and could I arrange to see my solicitor and have a meeting and go through all the questions at one time?
yeah, yeah. That's really helpful. Thank you. So what would you advise people to do in preparation for their very first meeting? I know that the very first meeting with a solicitor can be really daunting. Lots of people have never had to go and meet a solicitor before about anything. So, what can they do to really prepare and feel confident going into that meeting with you?
I think try and be as organised as possible and gather as much information as you can for that meeting in terms of financial aspects. Coming in an organised, prepared way will help the solicitor give you the best advice they can, but also writing down maybe 4 or 5 pertinent questions that you think are really important. I need to know the answer to these in order to be able to move on with the next step of my life. Because sometimes it's so overwhelming in that initial appointment. You get such a lot of information initially that sometimes you can forget those really important questions going in. So just perhaps take a little note with you into the appointment of what you actually want the answer to come out of that appointment, knowing the answer to. And even if we don't have time in that appointment, we follow it up with a letter afterwards. So even if we haven't covered those questions, the client can say, oh, well, I've still got one question on my list. Perhaps you can write to me with the answer so that we are covering everything that they want to cover in that initial appointment for them.
Yeah, I know when my first divorce in particular, I found it really helpful to take my dad with me into meetings. He was under very strict instructions not to speak
Yeah.
and not to interfere in the meeting, but he just literally wrote things down. I found that really
Yeah.
helpful because
Yeah.
I just couldn't compute it all.
Mm-hmm.
My brain was in kind of panic mode the
Mm-hmm.
entire time right at the beginning then. Um, and in fact, I think I can only remember one sentence from the entire meeting, which was when my solicitor said, "You don't have to do anything yet."
Yeah, absolutely.
So, whew, thank goodness
Yeah.
for that. So it can be really helpful perhaps to take somebody along to help in some of that process too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so one thing that I hear quite often is that my clients say they want to agree everything between themselves. They don't want to involve solicitors at all, or alternatively, that their partner is really resistant to engaging with a solicitor. So do you have any advice that you can offer to people in that situation?
I mean, we come up against that quite a lot. And like you said, this is a process. It's got a start, it's got a middle, and it's got an end. And you can only control yourself in that process. We have to start the process in order to get to the end point. So if you have somebody on the other side who is perhaps reluctant initially to engage, generally we find out some point they do. They might show initial signs of not wanting to get a solicitor themselves or not cooperating in the process, but ultimately you have to engage and you have to reach a resolution. So I would say to a client, you can only control yourself, you can only control your own situation. We have to do this in order to get to the next stage. We're going to do that anyway. Whether the other person engages in that process is their choice. We can't control what they do. We can only control what we do and what decisions that you make.
Yeah,
So it's very difficult sometimes when you do have somebody like that on the other side. But generally speaking, as the case progresses, they do become involved because they have to be. It is a negotiation process, and if they don't become involved, unfortunately, that's the point where court proceedings get issued, and then they are governed to comply with court directions, and so have to comply
yeah.
and have to
And I guess
become.
that becomes another don't ignore a court
Yeah,
deadline.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if you're in a court process, we obviously try to avoid court wherever we possibly
Mm,
can. But when you are in a court process, you absolutely have to follow those court deadlines.
yeah. So what would your advice be to somebody whose ex-partner has come up with a a detailed proposal of
Mm,
what they're offering
mm,
effectively, you know, a kitchen table agreement, I suppose.
mm. Um, I suppose that's very difficult because when they come in initially, we don't have the full financial disclosure.
Mm,
And as part of the financial process, the first step is to complete what we call Form E's and exchange that information. Sometimes clients do come in and say, oh, we've sat down and we've worked it all out between us and this is what we want to do. If that is the client's instructions and they're not asking us advice on the fairness of the settlement,
mm,
then we can draft a financial agreement that they can both sign, but they aren't receiving advice as to whether it's fair, right in the circumstances. And we always advise clients that it is in their best interest to do the financial disclosure process to make sure that what they are agreeing to is right and fair. They may be sort of getting led down a garden path that isn't
mm,
actually financially right for them. And with a limited amount of work, so it's not going to cost the earth, they will then have the peace of mind of knowing, okay, is this agreement fair to me? If it is, great, my solicitor can type it up for me and we can both sign it. And if it's not fair to me, oh, well, I'm glad I actually listened to my solicitor and we did go through this process because actually, I was being sort of pushed into an agreement that I didn't really want to get into. And I'm glad I've now taken that legal advice and I have got a fair financial settlement in the end.
yeah. Another thing that I'm asked quite often as well is if you're going to be using if you're going to go to mediation, for example,
Mm,
can you combine that with legal
absolutely.
advice, ad hoc
Yeah.
legal advice on the side? Because
And,
lots of
and
people are really
should
unclear about that.
Yeah, and should do so. We would always actively encourage if somebody can go down a mediation route and use that path to try and reach and narrow the issues between them to reach an agreement. We'd always recommend that you do take legal advice alongside mediation because the mediator will not give you legal advice. The purpose of the mediator is to try and reach an agreement between you. The mediator won't give each party legal advice as to whether the agreement is in their best interests or not. So it is really, really important that you do go and get legal advice alongside the mediation process so that you are pursuing a course that is in your best interest. And then if mediation is successful and you reach an agreement through mediation, the parties would come back to their lawyers and we would then implement the legal agreement. It won't become legally binding through mediation until the solicitors draw it up and it's submitted to the court for approval.
Yeah, yeah. And something that I actually asked earlier this week as well, if you've come to an agreement together and you go down the route that you were describing just now, where you write up the documents but you're not giving actual legal advice, is there a risk of the court saying, actually, that's not fair and
Absolutely.
throwing your agreement out?
Absolutely, yeah. So when we submit a financial order to the court, we have to complete a form that accompanies that. That form will give the court an overview as to all the financial assets that are in the case. If the court looks at that and the judge thinks this does not seem like a fair settlement to me, the judge has a discretion to not approve the order. So he could
Mm,
refuse to make the order, and the order could come back to us with certain questions being raised. So if it was completely biased in one person's favour, that's an actual likelihood that it could happen. If
mm,
it's slightly in one person's favour as opposed to the others, there may be legitimate reasons as to why that's the case. For instance, that party has care of the children or has a higher earning capacity. But there could be reasons as to why that agreement has been reached. And it may not be so disproportionate and a departure from equality that the court thinks, okay, based on those circumstances, I'm happy to allow it to go ahead.
mm.
But if it is very biased, then absolutely the judge does have the discretion to not approve the order.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. So are there, just wondering whether are there other mistakes, in your career that you've seen people make, um, going through
Um,
divorce that you would like to warn people against?
I think the most important thing for me, and the thing that comes up generally sort of on an everyday basis, is the level of conflict. People become so fixated on things that aren't really legal issues, but they impact upon them so emotionally greatly that it overruns any process that we're trying to achieve for them. They become so entrenched in the conflict that the costs can escalate out of control. And ultimately, what you're arguing about is disproportionate to the
Mm,
actual value of the assets that are in the case sometimes. So I think the holistic nature of the job that we do and the job that you do as a divorce support coach is just so important, because taking the emotional element out of what we do means that we can focus and get the clients to move in the direction of travel that they want to move in to reach the financial resolution that they want.
Yeah.
So the conflict, I think, is the most difficult thing to
Mm.
draw the clients back from, and so that they can take that step back, take the 24 hours, look at the bigger picture. What are we arguing about? Is it pertinent to what we're trying to resolve here in the long term? Can we put it to the side? If you can, that's going to make your life so much easier in going through this process. You will come out of it in a much better way than you will the more the cogs turn on the conflict and the more fuel that's in the fire. Unfortunately, the more difficult it is and the more traumatized that the parties will come out at the end of it.
Yeah. And I often say to my clients as well, it takes one of you to step away from
It
that.
does.
If you're both
Absolutely.
invested in that cycle of
Absolutely.
conflict,
Yeah.
it's going to keep spiraling. If
Absolutely.
one of you can step outside of it, then
Absolutely.
that gives it a chance to
Mm,
the
breathe.
boiling temperature to
Yeah.
go down.
Mm-hmm.
And even if the other person continues to be very full of conflict and
Mm-hmm.
difficult, you can minimize the impact on yourself by remaining calm,
Mm-hmm.
by taking your emotion out of the
Mm-hmm.
situation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, that emotional regulation piece is for me the crux of everything.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's dealing with things in the way that you see best. How would you want to be treated in this situation? If you're reading stuff all over social media, for instance, where derogatory comments are coming out, it's just fueling the fire. It's in a negative cycle. And it's very difficult to step out of that. If
Mm,
if you take the viewpoint, okay, I can only control my own situation, and what is in my control is I can control how I'm going to deal with this, how I'm going to interact with my solicitor, what points I'm going to respond to. Uh, if this cycle of negativity continues, I'm just not going to allow it to happen. So it's really taking that step back. And that's really going to emotionally settle you. You're going to feel much more in control. It's going to have a massive impact on your costs in the case, because you're not going to be fighting fire with fire all the time. You're going to be taking that step back, just dealing with the pertinent issues to resolving the case. And I think generally when clients take that point of view and take that step back, they do feel much more empowered. They
mm,
feel much more in control, and they know that their costs aren't going to escalate out of control because they're not going to allow them to be. So it is
mm.
taking sort of that responsibility for yourself back.
Yeah, absolutely. And that feels like a really great
Mm.
place to finish our discussion. I think I'm just going to check to see if there are any questions. I don't think so. If anybody has got any questions that they want to ask, so we've got a few people on today, just pop them into the Q&A now. And all that remains for me to say is that next time we are meeting on, I'm going to find where I wrote it down. Uh, we are meeting on May the 15th for our next one, and we're going to be talking about whether divorce can ever be a good thing, which should be a really interesting discussion, I think. So if there are somebody's just popped a question in, just a second. Oh, so somebody's asked you, do we feel that using something like Our Family Wizard is helpful regarding children? Um, the quick answer to that, I think, is yes.
So,
It helps, it keeps everything in one place. Our Family Wizard also has a tonometer. I think you
yeah,
pay a little bit extra for the
yeah.
tonometer, but it's probably worth it. That will kind of say, this message seems a little bit inflammatory. Do you want to phrase it in a different way? It enables everything about the children to be in one place. It keeps it out of kind of general email, general WhatsApp. I think it's a really good idea. I've seen clients use it really, really effectively. And you can carry on using it for however long you need to. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Emily.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really effective tool, and clients are using these sorts of apps more and more. Like you say, it keeps everything in one place. It can ask you to rephrase the wording that's being used. Sometimes people aren't necessarily aware of the language they're using or how it could come across. So it really prompts you to make sure that the messages you are sending are child focused and child friendly. It's purely to be used for arrangements concerning children. It's not to be used as a sort of point scoring from one parent to another. It can't be used in any abusive way. And it's a direct record which can be used and is used in court proceedings. So it is something that can be referred to. It can be a really useful tool, and we do really encourage clients to use it where possible.
Yeah.
They do
I
find
think
it very useful.
you can also put there's got shared calendar, hasn't it? And you can put
Mhm,
photographs in it and
mhm,
all sorts of things.
mhm.
So you can share all the information that you need to about children in one place. So
Yeah.
yes, it's
So, and I think
a
there's other
long
apps
way
as
to
well.
say yes.
Yeah, I don't think it's just Family Wizard. I think there are other apps that you can use as well. But
Mm,
it is very, I've had a really good response from clients in terms of feedback from that. So I think it is something we would definitely recommend if parties are in agreement to use it.
brilliant. So if there is nothing else, just all that remains is for me to say thank you, Emily, for your expertise today, and also thank you for everybody for coming along and watching us live. And we'll send out we'll get the recording uploaded onto the Walker Family Law System as soon as we can. So thank you very much.